citizen.
Out of many
we are world citizens, same vision is for equal rights and justice for the people them. What's happening to this beautiful world that we're living in? World citizen, lift up your voices.
Welcome.
Oh, you know
Welcome to another episode of the People-Powered Planet podcast, where each week we have extraordinary guests focusing on not just the huge number of problems of the world, but on solutions. We call them solutionaries. These are the people who are the forerunners helping to visualize and create the new models and the new visions that will help draw us into a society that can survive and flourish on planet Earth. And in a few minutes, we're going to have Rosie von Lila as our special guest. She is currently in the middle of her other podcast that she does. She does the very interesting Human Flourishing podcast, and she'll be joining us at 10:15. But I'll tell you a little bit about her. She doesn't need to hear her introduction because she knows all about her. So, you know, she's a collaborator with Riane Eisler, who wrote the incredible book, The Chalice and the Blade. How many of you, I don't know if you can do a show of hands, but how many of you read that years ago, back in 1987 when that came out? A very inspiring new way of looking at our history and the world. And she's also a partner with Riane Eisler in the Center for Partnership Systems. And she's working on the development of a social wealth index to document the enormous economic value of all the work that caregivers give. I mean, you know, families and so many things that aren't valued in our current economic system, the creating of the next generation of children and of young people who will be touching our world. That's not valued in our society. That needs to be, and that's what she's working on in this program. She's also a correspondent for Burning Man Live, a historian of the Burning Man culture and philosophy, works with the New American Alliance, advocating on behalf of Latino and diverse asset managers to bring equitable access to capital to this underserved community. And she's been has 20 years of experience in building participatory cultures and communities around the world. She's the author of a stakeholder engagement, social business ecosystems, and more. So, and has this podcast, Human Flourishing.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see you.
How are you doing today? How was your other podcast?
It was good. We're hosting 100 Days of Human Flourishing on Clubhouse. And so every day at 12:30 Eastern, we spend about 30 to 45 minutes with people from all over the world talking about human flourishing.
Wow, that sounds great. We'd love to connect with you more about that. So let me just start off. One of the reasons why we're highlighting you today is that you've had a long collaboration with Riane Eisler at the Center for Partnership Systems, working on how we actually begin to implement a new kind of index, other ways of carrying out the ideas of the chalice and the blade. For those who aren't familiar with it, could you start out giving us just briefly a little bit about how this book suddenly changed our whole view of what the history of the world was like? That's a pretty big thing for a book to do. What was the old model that's come through in the stories and myths that we tell ourselves, and how did she determine what archaeological finds and so on show that's actually there's actually a whole different way to look at what is the history of humanity?
So to start a little bit with Riane's background and her motivation for writing The Chalice and the Blade, Riane is Jewish, and her family fled the Nazis, and they made it onto a boat to Cuba, and the ship that they were on was the very last ship that was allowed to stop in Cuba. Her parents moved into an industrial slum, and they started a factory there. So they're very industrial people. They lived there for about 6 years and then came to the United States through Florida. And so she went from being a refugee living in an industrial slum, then coming to the United States and really witnessing for the first time skin-based racism. color-based racism. And she was shocked at this, and she's still a little girl at this point, a teenager. They come to California, fast forward, it instilled in her this question of how can human beings be so bad to each other? So she ends up studying law at UCLA. And before she started studying law, she got married in the late 60s. She wanted to get divorced. She had 2 daughters at that point. And, you know, back in that day, you didn't get divorced. Her first book that she wrote was on no-fault divorce. And then she wrote a book after that, once she was an attorney, on the Equal Rights Amendment. And this was back in the 70s. So she's like on the frontier of seeing equality for human beings, and making sure that human rights was an important part of conversation that was happening. So while she was in law school, she met David Loy, her partner for the last 40 years, who just passed away in the last 2 weeks. And they had such an inspiring romance and relationship. And he really was there for her in those, it took her 10 years to write The Chalice and the Blade. She studied and researched and always in pursuit of this question of how is it that human beings can be so terrible to each other, and is there another way? Because just by the observation of even looking at children, we can see that toddlers care for each other and help each other instinctively. There have been numerous studies done that show the behavior of toddlers. If a person drops something, the child will pick it up and go to hand it back. And so she kept pulling on this thread of human beings are inherently caring. We care about each other. And so she spent a decade researching and writing this book, and her research took her studies and her attention all around the world, looking at different archaeological sites. One that she points to was on the island of Crete. Another was in the area we now call Turkey. And you can see from these massive archaeological sites that the disparity between the elites in that community at that time and those who were at the lower part of society was not massive. And you could tell this based on what was the difference in the large burial in the large burial remains, what kinds of things were buried with a person if they were in the higher levels of the society versus somebody who's a normal person on the lower level. You can see it in the sizes of the large houses compared to the small houses. So through these kinds of artifacts, you can see what was the level of disparity in certain civilizations. She also noticed in the art of those times in these civilizations that the art was very much focused on spotlighting and venerating nature and natural cycles. So the moon is often very present. Plants are very present. You find lots and lots of figures of women representing fertility, representing a celebration of the ability to make life. Over time, those cultures were subsumed or they died out, and they were replaced by cultures that venerate the blade. So these are cultures that celebrate and see, raise to the highest respect, death. And I don't mean that, it's so interesting. In the United States, we have such a weird relationship with death, if we have one at all. It's something that many people shy away from discussing, and yet we celebrate war culture and we celebrate domination. And you can see a real shift in art over time, moving to, rather than making it central, fertility and women and nature, there becomes this glory in war, this glory in the celebration of the blade.
Now, so why is the chalice the symbol of the feminine and the partnership collaborator society?
Well, the chalice represents the womb, and it represents the ability to give life and the ability to nurture and sustain life.
So there's a big contrast, because we're often taught, we see these images, the old caveman days, you know, the guys dragging the women by their hair or something crazy like that. And that's all a fiction, because in reality, we emerged out of a participatory society where women were nurturers, but it wasn't that the women were on top and that they were the the dominators, that instead it was more partnership, correct?
Well, we have to be careful of saying that history was any one way. History was many ways. And the story that you're sharing is often subsumed by the story of the caveman dragging the cave woman by the hair. The fact is that there have been many cultures and many civilizations throughout history that have had partnership as the way that they led people. It was the way that they governed and existed together because that supported their survival. Being pro-social gives human beings a better chance at surviving and passing on our genes and living. So, it's her work since the Chalice and the Blade came out in 1987, and she and David together formed the Center for Partnership Studies, which in the last year became the Center for Partnership Systems, because there's now plenty of research on partnership. And she's written over 14 books, everything ranging from economics. She wrote a book called The Real Wealth of Nations in 2007. Most recent book came out in 2019, Nurturing Our Humanity, which she wrote co-authored with anthropologist Douglas Fry. And this book really gets into the neuroscience of how human beings are primarily wired for partnership.
So that's very interesting, because when you look at military training, for example, boot camp, they have to forcibly train out of people their sense of caring for others, their sense of having a conscience, and they call having a conscience an illness. Somehow you cared about others and it deeply harmed you to have to hurt others, and so it's very interesting to have a shift to realize that that's not necessarily innate. Now, one of the things, of course, she points out and you talk about is that here was Jesus, someone who actually worked with women, championed the partnership society, stopped them from stoning a woman. He who's without sin cast the first stone. And that somehow that beautiful message, which is taken over, like part of the world, somehow, how did the dominator culture deal with that? Did they embrace it, or what did they do?
This is one of the things that I was so moved by in The Chalice and the Blade. And then she has another book on sexuality, which I'm forgetting the name right now, but that goes deeply into the myths of suppression of women. One of the ways that culture, so first to back up for just a minute. So what Riane introduced in The Chalice and the Blade is the domination partnership social scale. And on one end, you have domination culture. And in domination culture, you have a rigid hierarchy. And the people at the top are the in-group, everybody else is the out-group. And the people at the top maintain that rigid hierarchy through violence, domination, fear, coercion. Under this type of social structure, you have human rights abuses, you have a decrease in innovation, a decrease in creativity, you have persecution of intellectualism, you have books being burned, and this is where the practice of the sword comes into play. On the other end of the spectrum, you have partnership culture. Partnership culture, and Riane is she's very clear. I've heard her say this a million times. Partnership culture is not about kumbaya. It's not about we're all here to live in peace. Let's do that. She talks about how somebody was just bringing me this book. Thank you. This is the other book, Sacred Pleasure. This is, I think, her biggest book. It's a good 400 pages. Well worth the read. Has lots of stories about religion and culture in it. So on the partnership side, she makes sure to make clear the point that hierarchies are a biological part of being a human animal. And she coined the term hierarchy of actualization. In a hierarchy of actualization versus a hierarchy of domination, hierarchy of actualization, the benefits flow both ways. They flow to the top and they flow downward so that the whole of society is nurtured. respect flows both ways. It isn't just about placating somebody at the top. It is about there being a fundamental element of care in the culture and the systems that are created for the culture.
Well, we're very, very interested in, and the whole idea behind our People Powered Planet podcast is Gary's interest was originally in how do we apply systems thinking to how we systematically create a better way to run our world rather than just accept this old dominator culture. And you mentioned I'm very interested in hearing more about the actualization what does that actually mean in terms of hierarchy by actualization?
Hierarchy of actualization. So it means that care for human beings and care for human potential and care for and dignity for everyone is important. It means that having systems that support human potential is important. My work around human flourishing, my life is dedicated to building work that supports flourishing, and specifically mass human flourishing. And as I say all the time, there is no long-term mass human flourishing without planetary flourishing. So the two are connected.
So why the term actualization? What does that mean in terms of, what does that mean about what rises to the top in terms of the hierarchy? What does it actualization mean in that case?
Well, she's building off of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and self-actualization being the pinnacle of human potential. So it's pointing to we are going to have hierarchies. That's biologically wired into us as animals. And so we can choose as a thinking, reasoning animal to have a hierarchy that supports the flourishing of everybody, not a hierarchy that oppresses a bunch of people to the benefit of a few.
Mm-hmm. Well, so for instance, as we talk about systems kind of thinking, we're seeing more interactive ways of kind of allowing leadership to merge and bubble up out of our well, you could call it our actualization, our natural inclinations. When we have these interactive meetings and Zoom meetings, the people who begin to take more responsibility for the good of the whole. We also have these things where people can get rated by others. They're supported by their community. They get more likes. They get more people acknowledging that they're giving something useful that's helpful to others. How do you see implementing on a global level a shift in structure to instead of rising to the top, the most violent and oppressive, to rising to the top, those who are kind of helping to actualize and interact with others?
Those who are pro-social. So I think that it comes down to antisocial behavior versus pro-social behavior. So let's see. First off, I loved the movie. I watched the movie about Gary, and I'm really inspired by the World Passport. And I loved his audacity and his boldness, and I'm going to try it. And Eleanor Roosevelt telling him, do it, form a government. And then eventually, all those years later, him coming around and being like, okay, I'll do it. That is, and then also the self-awareness of being in Paris and recognizing when all of those thousands of people were cheering for him and wanting to hear what he had to say, recognizing that he was very close to becoming exactly what he was railing against. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the first thing is to recognize that every human being has within us the capacity to act in an antisocial way. We all do. If you get pushed enough, if you're threatened enough, you could lash out and do something that you thought before never would have been possible. So recognizing that. The second thing is, so your question is, how do we go about creating systems of actualization, getting people at the top who are pro-social effectively? I've been thinking about this for a while, and this is not a fully baked idea. I like to put ideas out there for discourse, and then we come up with a solution together. I think that that's a really important part of creating human governance. So the idea is this. a very small percentage of human beings are psychopaths or are borderline psychopathic. There are really specific traits. There are genetic markers for it. There are biologic functions of the brain that affect whether or not somebody feels empathy, whether or not they feel fear, whether or not they're violent. A lot of it has to do with both biological and environmental. So in Riane's work, she talks about adverse childhood experiences and the massive study that was done on this and tracking individuals over time who experienced abuse when they were young and what happens when they're older. And we know that abuse negatively impacts children who then go on to become adults and are more susceptible to destructive behavior. So where does psychopathy come into this? Well, if you are a person who has the biological markers for psychopathy, those genes can be turned on by being in an environment that is an adverse childhood experience. So experiencing trauma can turn on in you a orientation towards antisocial behavior, isolation behavior, and violence. Now, I'm a person who tends to see the best in people, and I look for ways to be compassionate and understand people. I think that something that is missing in the world that is starting to emerge is transparency and compassion around different cognitive abilities. So there's a really interesting guy named Jim Fallon. He's a neuroscientist who at 60 years old discovered that he is a borderline psychopath. And he had no idea that this was what was going on with him, because he was just a normal functioning scientist. And he ended up discovering on this amazing journey, he found out that he's borderline psychopath, but he calls himself a pro-social psychopath. And he says what he eventually learned is that by coming out about it and writing a book about it, the game is up. People now know how he tries to manipulate other people. And so he can kind of be at ease. He says, this was a few years ago. He's like, I'm 66 years old. Do I really want to keep running my games of manipulation? Mm-hmm. Okay, how does this play into governance? Well, in both corporate governance and in elected leadership, psychopaths are overrepresented. It's depending on what study you're pulling from, it's anywhere from 10% up to 30% of leaders have these traits of not feeling empathy and of not caring about others. You can see what an issue this is for people if they're leading us and they're not genuinely caring. And so this is how you end up with a situation with somebody like the last president of the United States, who seeks to create chaos all around him as a means to maintain control. If everybody else is upset and in chaos, he can be at the top of that hierarchy of domination and in charge. So how do we get the right people to rise up to the top? How do we get pro-social people to rise up to the top? Well, so I have a long background in history with Burning Man. I've met a lot of interesting people at Burning Man. One of them is a guy named Nicholas Berggruen, who is a billionaire, and he funded this big institute out in California, which is the Berggruen Institute, studies democracy. Years ago, almost a decade ago, he said to me, I think that American democracy is going to fail. And this was like 10 years ago. And I was like, no way. Like, how could that even be possible? Like, we take it so for granted that things are going to stay the same. And now, all these years later, I have to say I've moved more towards his direction. So he co-wrote a book with a guy named Nathan Gardells, and they looked at if you set aside human rights abuses and the domination culture, they looked at what are some of the functions of the Chinese government that make it work well over the long term. The first thing that they do is they have a 1,000-year cycle that they're looking at. How do we build this for stability to last 1,000 years? One of the other things they do is if you want to be in elected governance, you have to work your way up. So you have to earn your way from the small level of governance up to the higher levels, or you have to take an exam that proves that you know the laws and you know how to govern. So if we have something like that, whatever form of governance system we end up with, I think American democracy is definitely changing. The nation state is definitely changing. The internet has been ushering that in for a few decades now, with cryptocurrencies and everything that's happening with all these frontier things on the development of technology. It's putting the nation state at risk, which I know Gary would have loved.
Right.
And
Right.
I think it's going to push us beyond there. So what do we do with governance? I think governance becomes more localized. I think that it's leading smaller groups of people who care about each other. I think that there has to be some kind of check on people getting into power. So they have to either prove through experience and working their way up, or they have to take some kind of exam that says that they understand the agreements, the social agreements of a society, of a given society, whether that's the Constitution or whether it's a set of laws.
Right.
And then going back to the psychopaths. So I don't think psychopaths should be shunned.
Right.
I think that, like Jim Fallon, you can be a functioning pro-social psychopath and make a valuable contribution to the world. Going back to being transparent about mental health and destigmatizing mental health, when we get to a point where people can be upfront about, I'm on the autism spectrum, I am borderline psychopathic, we can create the majority, like almost 100% of human beings are empathetic and pro-social.
Uh-huh.
And so I think that we can eventually generate a culture that supports people in creating hierarchies of actualization, no matter what their cognitive abilities are.
Right. Well, one of the things that that Gary was talking about as we've developed and worked together on talking about the people-powered planet is and it's very evident in this integrity system he had, is how we create a dynamic system that, on the one hand, you have personal actualization, people changing internally and so on, but you also at the systemic level currently have systems that are a race to the bottom. The current system is, with 51% winning and 49% losing, and then one side dominating the other. There's no incentive for collaboratively drawing out what is really our best ideas. But if you took people on these opposite side of the issues, and instead of the question being, who wins and who loses, is what kind of what is our pain? Where are we coming from? What do we want to create together? What's our vision? You start finding terrific commonality. I mean, people everywhere want a better life for their children, and they want stability, they want peace, they want, they don't want the things that are happening. And yet here we have a world where it's not just one administration or another. I mean, here we have the current administration plunging us toward the possibility of, we're plunging as a planet toward the possibility of nuclear war, nuclear extinction for these transient reasons that, in the larger scheme of human life and the incredible beauty of this precious marble in space, seems so insignificant. And to imagine a species smart enough to send probes around the planet of the world looking for signs of intelligent life, and yet lack the intelligent life to solve its problems in more creative ways, and systematically take good people and put them in a course of action that drives them toward the most destructive and negative of behavior. So I'm glad you're thinking about some new interactive systems that maybe as people interact in this new, as Gary said, this system that brings to the top the highest and best wisdom of each individual, we're all engaged in tests and studies and learning, so that we are rising to the top, the people who are the most able to serve rather than the most able to dominate. The question is, if we take your idea, you're saying that leaders should kind of have to pass a test, but more or less it should be, if we're all interacting in these groups as built around the geodesic sphere. I explained that earlier that in Gary's model built around this, each person's on top of the world in their area. I briefly mentioned that in a company, the president's on top as far as administration coordination, but the janitor's on top in terms of keeping the bathroom flowing. If they're overflowing and shut down, the whole operation shuts down. And so each one of us is on top in our area. As we have these kind of interactive, almost Zoom-like calls where we bring people together across the political boundaries that divide us, maybe we need to build systemically into it that the people who are most able to understand human rights, pass a series of tests, be acclaimed by their fellow by their fellow members, be people who are endorsed, and we're seeing the internet giving us this new capability, endorsed for their skills in these areas and so on, that these are the people that rise to the top naturally, not with a voting win-lose system, but with emergence of a million leaders all helping to interact together. And then Gary saw these kind of interactive, synergistic groups of a small number of people interacting with others, and others all coming together and being amalgamated into the highest and best wisdom of the planet. And that's creating a very power just by not needing military force or war, because once we start finding a way to create what the Declaration of Human Rights, says that the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. Almost every constitution says that. The U.S. Declaration of Independence said it is the right of the people to institute government. And as you saw in the movie, Gary said, well, hey, who's these people? Is it old guys in gray wigs, or is it you and I? Well, if we institute this new interactive governing system, the very fact that law is the codification of the will of humanity, basically, but we've been stuck with an old system where we choose imperfect judges because they're pointed out of political systems. But if we develop the kind of thing you're talking about, something that emerges where the collaborative instinct, where the actualization helps emerge the natural leaders in these interactive groups, maybe we can devise a system that will bring to the top the highest and best wisdom in each individual, and help amalgamate that into this highest and best wisdom of the planet. And companies and everybody else will go along. If this is what people want, if this is like Gandhi said, there go my people, I'm their leader, I must follow them. Once it's a big enough number of people creating that as the will of the planet, all the bad companies will jump into saying, hey, we're world citizens, we want to be part of this.
Mm-hmm. I think that part of it, so the work I'm up to with Mass Human Flourishing is, I say that when you put that at the center of the purpose of a company or the purpose of a governance system, the purpose of an economic system, and again, Mass Human Flourishing is dependent on planetary flourishing. They are not, you can't separate them. But when you put that as the purpose of economics and governance, it shifts what happens. So if a company, before it's making a product, or when it's determining if it's going to make a product, if it puts at the center of its design process and the purpose of that product the question of, does this contribute to mass human flourishing, that shifts whether or not the product gets made.
Wow, that's perfect. That's a great time to segue to questions, because I love that. That's kind of what Gary was talking about. And in these integrity groups, he took the poorest women at the lowest levels in Africa, for example, refugee women, stateless women, and he helped them come into these integrity questions. And he asked, how can we as sovereign world citizens govern our world? And he got amazing answers from these people who you think, well, do these people think about this? Yes, they do want to have a voice in the world. They do want to have an interactive way of doing it. And it was astounding the kind of answers he got. So putting out the right question is perfect. And that's a great time to segue to questions. Melanie, you want to take on the question period?
Absolutely. My goodness. I am so thrilled, Rosie, you're here. We are honored to have you. Phenomenal. Everything you've said so far is just so eye-opening, I'm sure, for a lot of people. I was so happy. I actually read The Chalice and the Blade and actually took a course at the Center for Partnerism Systems, now changed the name. And it's really, honestly, I'm recommending this to everyone, because it is a whole way of looking at the world, and a gentler way. It's rather than, it's awful and things are crazy and what do we do and panic, just your description of, hey, there's people who are sociopaths and we love them and they're great. They could be surgeons. They could do things like firefighting and things like that. But, we don't want them in positions where they don't have empathy and, these certain qualities that need to be in leadership. So I love what you said there, and thank you for that.
I want to clarify on that, because I don't ever want to preclude someone from doing a role because they have a cognitive condition. What is important is that if somebody's going to serve as a president and they happen to have all the markers for psychopathy, that's an important conversation to have with the people that they're working with, so that corporate psychopathy is a real thing. Workplace bullying is a real thing. These things happen. But I think that if there were, and I don't know how this would look. I don't know how it would look in terms of transparency, but I think it's an idea worth looking at. Of, you have to go through an assessment. Okay, if you do end up having the markers for psychopathy, or you're borderline psychopath, or you are actually a categorical psychopath, then that should be known. And it should be, if the person wants to then take office or serve as the CEO, that they have to divulge that to somebody in their network, whether that's the people that they work with or their constituents. I don't know what it looks like, but I think it's important.
I love that. And I love the fact that you're, not precluding that, okay, you're going to be like this just because you have these markers. So yes, very important. And yes, how does that look? How would that look? This is a great conversation. And it's very hopeful because, yes, for people who are wondering how is this going to work out, there's also a great movie I watched last night. I sent an email to you, La Belle Verte. We're always talking about, what does the future look like? What can the future look like? And I highly recommend this film. We're going to show it. We're going to have a movie discussions, not next week, but the following week. And it's called La Belle Verte. And I'll put that in the chat. So very exciting. Yes, we want to do some questions. So David Beatty is our first person to ask a question. David, go right ahead.
I'm very glad to be here for the first time. I talked to David Gallup recently, and I decided I should come along and have a look at the people-powered evening I'm on here, so I learn how to protect myself against Arthur's enthusiasm for everything that he knows about in the organization. So I will be a little bit more prepared to be front and center. And the question that I really like Rosie's opinion on, anyone else who wants to say something, is that we live in the system we live in. Most people depend on money to be able to do what they need to do to survive or to make a career that they appreciate. And at the same time, we know the money system that we're in is not able to handle the problems we're facing. There's blockchain and everything showing up. So I'm very curious, Rosie, how you see the blend of an alternative currency is also a social aggregation tool.
Thank you for the question, David. I think it was inevitable and a long time in coming that the current administration in the United States has said that cryptocurrencies are a security threat. And I think that that is true because they do threaten the current systems, the current fiat currency systems. I think that there's a lot of promise. There's one particular community and currency called SEEDS, SEEDS. And their goal is creating regenerative incentives and creating community that's focused on regeneration. I always say that regeneration it's different than sustainability. Sustainability is about sustaining what is, making a system that can continue going. Regeneration is about having a system that can both repair and restore what has been damaged and can continue to do that as the system goes along. So while I am an investor in some cryptocurrencies, I have been playing in the space for several years now. I'm not an expert in it, but I do know enough to say that it creates the opportunity for different kinds of incentives. It can incentivize different behavior. It can incentivize different participation. And I think that when we're talking about economic systems, and the money is merely a technology, it's merely a tool that we use. Part of why our economic system looks the way that it does, Kate Rayworth talks about this, is that we incentivize growth for growth's sake and endlessly.
Mhm.
So her work with donut economics talks about working within the constraints of our biosphere.
Mhm.
Humanity is a very complex thing. Our systems are very complex, but what I find amazing about living in this time, as overwhelming as it can be, as distracting as it can be, as harrowing as it can be, we've never been as connected globally as we are now. We've
Mhm.
never had the amount of communications tools that we do now. We've never been able to communicate like this in real time, in video, on opposite sides of the world. Like, this is a profound time to be alive and to
Mhm.
have these conversations, and to recognize, as Gary Davis said, just like stand up and do the thing and be willing to put your neck out there. I'm excited to get a world passport and test it out and see if it actually works. But like, that's the thing. It's about organizing, participating. I'm going to post a link to a framework that I wrote. This was back in 2015. I've been involved with Burning Man and the global Burning Man community for more than half my life. And so I wrote a framework on participatory culture and how do you build that. And Arthur, you were talking about asking the right question. The very first part of that framework is about attitude, and having an attitude of curiosity and inclusion, and asking people what they think is the solution, how they can get involved. So again, I think it comes down to smaller, more localized governance. It comes down to recognizing that human rights come with a duty to participate and steward the community. I think that it comes down to viewing money and incentives merely as technologies, and what technologies and systems are we going to create that actually support flourishing. The question of, does this support mass human flourishing, has to be at the center of our designs for currency, for technology, for company creation, product creation, economics, governance, all of it.
May I just say quickly, I'm very grateful that I tuned in tonight to see what was going on and you were going on. So I hope one way or the other, maybe next month or so, when we talk a bit more specifically about the future of this integrity protocol, I'd be very interested in your opinion on it if you happen to join that night, or now that I have your email and that, I will probably knock on your door anyway. So thanks for the answer to the question. I like the word incentives rather than currency. Currency gets you into an either or, and incentives is a and. So thank you.
I'm putting in a link. This is my friend Ramon Frey. He has thought far more about incentives than I have. He's one of the people that I go to learn about incentives. So there's his website. He writes a lot on Medium.
Thank you.
If you want to reach me, I'm on LinkedIn. My name is Rosie von Lila. Email is my least favorite place to be in the world. And so you can reach me on LinkedIn usually most easily. If you don't hear back from me, message me again. I'm increasingly, as I get older, enjoying spending time writing and less time messaging.
As you can see, everyone, Rosie is an incredible wealth of knowledge, and so interesting. And that's why you should all tune into her clubhouse room with David. Human flourishing for the next 100 days. It's the first 100 days of this year. So that, and also thank you, Rosie, for mentioning seeds. I'm talking a lot about seeds and the benefits of it, and just the community of the people talking about how we can do things better. So it's just a beautiful community. Also, you mentioned the passport, the world passport. So I just wanted to say that, yes, the world passport is phenomenal, human. It's a tool for humanity. In other words, it's based on the Declaration of human rights, Article 13.2 for traveling. Does it work? Well, it's like a hammer. You have to work it yourself. You have to know about the Declaration of Human Rights, and you want to read more about it on our website. And it's theworldsmycountry.com/passport. We have David Gallup here. He's the president of the World Service Authority. So you can go to his website. We don't want to keep Rosie too long, but we could forever because we love you, Rosie. I want to just we'll go now to Tom. Let's hear your question or comment. Tom, go right ahead.
Yeah, I really appreciate this show. Thank you, Rosie. And one word really stuck out in the discussion here: inclusion. And the word inclusion, a friend of mine in Australia and I have been working on doing a podcast. We're not there yet, but he and I both feel that future governance, as Arthur talks about on his podcast, people-powered planet and so forth, it's not going to be called a democracy. It's not going to be called some sort of social, like communism. We came up with the term inclusionism. Inclusionism is kind of like maybe covers what Arthur talks about, maybe covers what I've been talking about for a number of years. And the other thing I wanted to mention is a recent discovery of mine of just how evolving our technical abilities to converse with each other, just like we are now with Zoom. There's a platform called Discord that just kind of blows me away, because when I see platforms that are community building, as like with Facebook, I'm always at the 5,000 friend limit. I have real friends that I face talk with. I have a friend in Afghanistan who's married to the major newscaster, and they're government-owned TV. And Dan Hanley has finally gotten an appointment to sit down and talk to the premier about pilots.org. His whole thing is the 9/11, the Muslims. There were Muslims on the aircraft. They had no idea. They thought they were going to Cuba, maybe, And so the whole idea of using social media platforms to build community, we're in the little baby phases of it. You got Facebook, I've met so many people on Facebook, but Discord to me is really interesting because my roommate is a gamer, and in one particular game, there's thousands of people playing, and the game developer hooked up with Discord, made it part of the platform. They're organizing into guilds, and whoever's in the largest guild is going to survive the battles, whatever. Okay. So, I'm just saying that the technology event that we've been seeing for the last 30, 40 years with computers and so forth, that ain't nothing, folks. Wait a while. It's really going to beef up. And I truly believe that these platforms yet to be developed, like Arthur and I talked about 2 years ago, that you can reach in your pocket to your cell phone and actually connect with, let's say, somebody over in Afghanistan, or actually putting water wells in, or live active participation in changing our planet. And guess what, folks? Those people you talk about, psychopaths, they're not included in this, because it's going to be a bottom up, like Arthur talks about, the geodesic sphere and technology. Okay, we're entering into the final home stretch of that 150-year threshold between the age of Pisces, the age of religions and wars, and the age of Aquarius, which is the age of technology and peace. And we're using technology to organize. And I think it's very important that everybody here, we've been doing this broadcast for a couple of years. It's all about organization, collaboration, creating a synergy to change our world.
Well, thank
I
you,
don't know what
Tom.
he
Thank
said.
you. Thank you. I didn't see a question in there, but inclusionism, that was great. Rosie, did you have anything you wanted to chime in about that?
Sure. Let's see. I have strong opinions about Facebook and Facebook products and Google products. In 2015, so I started using Facebook around 2010. I started using Twitter in 2008. I had my Facebook account for probably a decade. And no, actually, it was a little bit less than that. Before Facebook, there was a website called tribe.net that I was a part of, and it went the way of the dodo because Facebook overtook everything. Facebook's business model and Google's business model, but particularly Facebook's business model, are based on making sure that your attention is trained on the app and on your screen. And neurobiologically, what keeps us engaged with the app and with the screen is content that makes us angry and content that makes us fearful. It does this by activating our amygdala. And so rather than exchanging cat videos all day long and seeing content about how beautiful stories and how beautiful the world is and ways that people are helping each other, that content doesn't keep us on the app as long as the content that makes you angry. So their goal is to keep your eyeballs on there as long as possible so that they make more money from advertisers. This issue with the business model has been known for years and years, and Facebook has not changed it. I was addicted to Facebook and I recognized it in 2015. And so I started to wean myself off in 2016. And over the course of 8 months, I eventually got to the point where I was like, okay, I'm thinking about quitting Facebook. I'm thinking about it. The election happens 2016. The very next day, I said, it is more important now than ever for me to focus. And so I decided to quit Facebook merely because I saw what it was doing to my mental health. I saw what it was doing to my effectiveness in the world. So I deleted it, permanently deleted it. It takes a couple of weeks to completely delete it because they keep coming back around to see if you want to make up and get back on there. So I did that. I stopped using Instagram in 2018, which is owned by Facebook. February of this year, I left WhatsApp. To my dismay, if you have the WhatsApp app and you have my phone number in your contacts, it will show you that I still have a WhatsApp account, but I don't. I completely permanently deleted it. So I find that to be suspect and irritating. I am going the opposite way of being plugged in. I have been increasingly inspired by Fran Lebowitz, as cantankerous as she may be. She's an iconic New Yorker. She's now 71 years old, never has had a cell phone, never has had a computer. Even though she's a writer, she writes everything by hand on a piece of paper, which I find fascinating. But what I've discovered in the last week, I took a break from Twitter because I was noticing I was sort of going down the spiral of getting a little on there towards people. So I took a break, and this week, I've had more mental space. I've been more productive. I feel good. And so I'm at the point where I'm starting to entertain ideas of how to pull the plug on my cell phone and actually have a landline. And so I'm going the other way because the evidence and the research is overwhelming of how negative these apps can be on our mental health. And I get having a connection with somebody on the other side of the world. What happened for me when I quit Facebook in 2016, the next 3 days, I was like, wow, I'm really lonely. What did I do? I picked up the phone and I called an actual friend. Can you imagine? I had a phone call and I was like, how are you? And so as a result of me pulling away from online communities, I'm still plugged in. And I think that online communities are really important in creating the opportunity for support and connection. And I think that that's beautiful. The problem is when it comes at the cost of mass human flourishing, when the tool is doing more harm, like Facebook's business model and what happened with Cambridge Analytica. They sold our data. They sold my data to Cambridge Analytica, which has been instrumental in undermining democratic elections. There's a great movie. It is called, the first one you should see is The Social Dilemma. It's called the Center for Humane Technology. Hold on. There you go. Okay, this is a fantastic. Yes, this is a fantastic website for educating yourself so you can be an informed user of technology and make choices that really work for you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Rosie. And thank you for sharing your experience with Facebook. It looks like, Tom, do you have like a quick thing, Tom? Because we're about at the end. Just quick, whoo, so fast.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, if you feel that you have psychopathic urges by using Facebook, contact me. Okay. I had childhood PTSD because my stepfather beat my mother to death when I was a kid. You want to talk about PTSD? Oh, and then that thing called Vietnam came along.
Yeah.
I've cured myself of PTSD by writing. I'm a writer. And you
And
can
a painter.
see my website in there. I'm over 1 million hits from 181 countries. And it's non-monetized. Once in a while, I get maybe some homemade beef jerky, or my cousin Barry sent me some venison jerky homemade. But what you said about technology, I have to disagree with, because the technology that Arthur and I have been talking about hasn't been invented yet. But something very similar to it is Discord. And I wrote about it on my website. Go to my website and read about it. But again, if anybody has an issue with Facebook, I used to be in jail 3 weeks out of every month. I have over 40 groups and pages of my own. So when I post something, I'm posting to about 100 groups and pages. Okay. And I get a lot of response. And I don't show, well, I do show my dog Shelton that Arthur and Melanie are very aware of and fond of. But the technology that I was describing earlier has nothing to do with Facebook. I'm just saying that what we're going to come into will be something that will start to link communities with like-minded people together all around the world.
Love it. Love it.
Okay. Yeah, I'm done.
Thank you, Tom.
Melanie.
Thank you. And by the way, that's a painting that Tom has done, and he's amazing. We love Tom. Thank you, Tom. Okay, Michael, you're up.
Yeah, I think I posted in the chat, since you're there in New York and you're so connected with Burning Man, do you know Daniel Pinchbeck, and do you follow his books and his writings?
On the 23rd, I am facilitating a conversation with him on Clubhouse.
On Clubhouse, I got to get in on that. I haven't been yet.
And it's open. Anybody can sign up now. Just Google Clubhouse. The app will come up. 8 p.m. Eastern, I'll be in conversation with Daniel Pinchbeck, and Ivy Asterisk will be talking about NFTs and Web3. And he is highly critical of it. So yeah, you're welcome to join us on that.
I would love to. And I want to follow up on what Tom is saying about the creating, really, going back to the famous quote, Buckminster Fuller, right? Create the wise alternative to Facebook, and this is what I think Tom's talking about and Arthur talks about. And what I've been discussing with David Gallup about using the World Citizen Passport as your core identity, as your authentic identity, which can exist on a blockchain or a holochain as a totally independent entity, which you control and can't be hacked, hopefully. And that can be the basis for the new community where we have strict guidelines on content, and it's high quality content. And it's what Tom was saying about driving. Okay, what can I do? Where can I get connected? Where can I go help build an eco village? Or how can I learn about permaculture and trainings and classes and things that matter and things that can be so beneficial to the individual and the community, and really connect us in positive ways, and leave all that political garbage to the side and say, this is where I want to be. I want to be in this citizen network where we're all about being a solutionary.
I highly recommend looking through Tristan's website, the Center for Humane Technology, because he's talking about all of this. And there are resources there. If you work in tech or you have an idea for tech, you can create attention nudges in an app that remind you that you're loved, that remind you that so-and-so, you and so-and-so had this experience 2 weeks ago, or they said this wonderful thing about you. Like, it can create this upward spiral of beneficence. So yeah, I'm with you. It's totally possible. Even though I'm starting to unplug myself more and more. I should say I'm selective, increasingly selective and discerning about where I plug in.
Thank you, Rosie. You're amazing. Please go to Clubhouse, go to Human Flourishing for the first 100 days. It's a beautiful program. She's going to be having a book come out, and I'll go back to Arthur. Arthur, take it away.
We enjoyed having you so much, and we look forward to maybe joining you in this 100 days and Clubhouse and the other exciting adventures that you're working on. And let me give Rosie one last chance to say her last parting word of where she most hopes will go to follow up on this.
Thank you, Arthur, and thank you, Melanie, for the invitation. And Melanie, thanks for your persistence in inviting me. My website is vonlila.com. I am intermittently active on Twitter at Rosie von Lila and on LinkedIn as well. So thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate it. And so that's it for another episode of the People Powered Planet podcast. Join us this every Wednesday at the same time, and have a wonderful week.
World citizen, lift up your voices. Oh, you know we got something to say. All we need is the same directions, heading in one way.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video.